Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, 12 African countries have reported cases of coronavirus so far. In a response to the pandemic, Algeria, which reported 25 cases and saw its first death linked to the illness on Thursday, closed all schools. I speak to the WHO's emergency response chief for Africa about plans to combat the pandemic. The effects have been economic. It's seen travel and trade massively scaled back. Egypt's particularly worried that the recovery of its fragile tourism industry could be stalled as visitors are kept away. We take a closer look. But first, 12 out of Africa's 54 countries have reported cases of coronavirus. In a response to the pandemic, Algeria, which reported 25 cases and saw its first death linked to the illness on Thursday, closed all schools. South Africa, which has the highest number of cases in sub-Saharan Africa, has seen the figures creep up to 16. However, overall, the region has seen fewer cases than others outside of the continent. Almost all have been imported from Europe. Several governments have ramped up screenings at airports and intensified efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19. And for a closer look at the continent's chances in dealing with the emergency, I'm joined by Dr. Michel Yao, Program Manager for Emergency Response at the WHO's Africa office. Dr. Yao, thanks very much for speaking to me. Now, first of all, as I mentioned there, coronavirus does seem to have been spreading relatively slowly in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Is there a reason for that? Or is it as good news as it seems?
We think that it is a good news, even if the risks remain very high for all the countries. And it's what we can notice now with many countries getting infected. Probably the fact that we do not have many cases is that maybe the importation process were not as we were expecting at the beginning, with also containment measures in China. Now that the hotspot has shifted to Europe, it's make it easier with regular flight to African countries. Now the challenge is to avoid now the community widespread that could be very challenging for African health services.
So how do things stand currently in terms of Africa's dealing with the coronavirus pandemic?
In most of the African countries have started the preparedness, and think we have some window to do it, but the window is quite narrowing now. So most of them have some preliminary measures, mainly the screening process, and at least a capacity to treat the first few cases. Now, what we are trying to do and advise them is to ensure that it did not spread further within the community. Because if it does, then it will be very, very difficult. From what we are seeing now in Europe, this kind of scenario will definitively overwhelm the system and could have a huge death toll.
So you mentioned that the importance of making sure that communities do what they can to prevent the spread of coronavirus. But how do you get individuals to comply with what is necessary? How do you get that message out to people and communities across a whole continent, in fact?
Yeah, this is an ongoing process, and it's actually part of the measure that we advise countries since January. One of the critical things, in addition to surveillance and treatment capacity, is to ensure that we have what we call an extended risk communication, so that communities can be more engaged. And for this one, we think that leaders should be more and more involved. Religious leaders, community leaders, we think it's really time to mobilize. And it's also time to overcome all the rumors that we have in the social media, because this is a real issue and people need to comply.
As you mentioned there's been a lot of fear linked to the spread of coronavirus, and a lot of focus on the potential fatalities. But do you think that people are starting to become more aware of the realities of the risk? And how do you push that message out?
We push this message out. Of course, now with the social medias, people are aware of what is going on, even since China. So the fear is increasing from social media. We know that we can see that there is a huge interest coming from the population. So it's not to scare more the population, but for them to be aware that this is a serious issue. And it's also the same for national authorities. It's a very, very high time for them to take it seriously, to push forward the preparedness, to involve local resources while we are trying to mobilize more to support them.
Now, in 2014, Western Africa saw the world's worst Ebola outbreak. There was a lot of lessons to be learned from that. How has that informed the response to the coronavirus pandemic?
We think we learned a lot collectively, WHO as well as all the different stakeholders, including government. And one of the main lessons is to involve communities. It's community engagement. And we even saw it in the outbreak, last outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo, where we had community resistance. Without a full compliance of the community is a major issue. What we learned also is that preparedness pays off. We can see the example in some of the countries, neighboring countries in DRC. One of them got a few cases of Ebola, but they managed to stop the spread. And this was based on preparedness. So early preparedness is really critical. And the other thing is that we should build on what was there. With this Ebola in West Africa, many countries started the preparedness process, and we are building on it right now, including the screening at the entry point, as well as isolation and treatment centers. And some of the epidemiologists that were also in this one had a lot of experience actually to be used for coronavirus.
Do you feel that there is enough international support in terms of shoring up Africa's efforts to deal with coronavirus?
We still have a shortage of funding, and actually countries are compiling the preparedness, let's say, response plans, and these plans need to be funded. We think it is worth investing now in this preparedness, because what is happening in Europe can be avoided if we have a system that can detect promptly and then can stop the spread from clusters or individuals to a wide community. That could be very, very challenging. It's a time also to help Africa to equip the treatment centers. It may require some of the intensive care, and the capacity is quite limited. So there is a need for funding to scale up right now, at least to face the worst scenario that is now a kind of probable scenario that could happen in Africa.
Thanks very much for speaking to us. Dr. Michel Yao from the WHO's Emergency Response Team for the African continent. Now, the response to the pandemic has seen travel and trade massively scaled back globally. Economies around the world have been rocked by measures and uncertainty surrounding the spread of COVID-19. Egypt is particularly worried that its economic recovery could be stalled by tourists being kept away. Maud Julien tells us more.
The cruise ship that brought the coronavirus to Egypt, the Asara. 20 passengers and crew members were tested positive for the disease, and 70 employees remain quarantined on board. Egypt's authorities have announced they would be sterilizing airports, and there are concerns the virus could take its toll on an industry that's still recovering from years of political turmoil. 2020 has been an excellent year for tourism so far, and professionals hope the numbers will keep rising.
Before the coronavirus, we were seeing great tourism seasons. During winter and summertime, the number of tourists was great. I believe the situation with the coronavirus is temporary and will disappear, and then tourism will pick up even more.
Last week, tourists continued to flock to the Tarnac temple, not far from where the cruise ship is docked. This French tourist says security was not an issue for her.
When we say we're going to Egypt, people ask, is it dangerous or not? But I don't think people have this fear anchored in them that it's dangerous here. That's not my feeling. They ask the question, but that's all.
The risk of infection didn't come into line, but that could change for future visitors. And there's a possibility that some of the most beloved sites may be temporarily shut down.
Well, a look now at other news. The leaders of Congo, Brazzaville, South Africa, Chad and Algeria met with the AU chief in Republic of Congo on Thursday in a bid to broker talks about Libya's political and security crisis. The city of Tripoli is under siege by the forces of Eastern Commander Khalifa Haftar. He's battling the UN-backed government based in the Libyan capital. International efforts to end the conflict have stalled. African leaders have called for a conference of national reconciliation for Libya. Algeria said it would be willing to host such a dialogue, but has also warned against excessive foreign intervention in the country. And finally, South Africa's Tourism Association, SATSA, has issued new guidelines that condemn the breeding of big game for the express purpose of tourism. Conservationists have been calling for the move, arguing that wild animals should not be born into captivity just to entertain holidaymakers. Young lion cubs are often removed from their mothers, and many kept in enclosures too small to meet their natural roaming instincts. SATSA's called for all breeders to stop all entertainment involving performing animals. Guidelines are non-binding, but welcome.
Lions should not have interaction with human beings. They should not be used as props. There's no conservation value in breeding lions in captivity, and there's definitely no educational value in breeding lions in captivity. Lion cubs that are removed from their mothers after just a few days after being born are very distressed initially. They miss their mums, and they miss out on very valuable and important nutrition right from day one, basically.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care. Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
Reporting from across West Africa.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches. Bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.